Christmas and creme brulee. I have had several requests for a video on how to make mac and cheese, and I promise that that one will come next week. The only reason I'm not doing this week is I still have too much leftover mac and cheese from National Mac and Cheese Day in my fridge to make it right now. But it did give me an idea for a new video format, and this is the debut of that format, talking about a religious issue while cooking. Today, I'm going to discuss the ridiculous attempts to reconcile the Gospels of the birth of Jesus while I make creme brulee. Creme brulee is quite easy to make. I hope you enjoy both. Let's have a chat. Hello and welcome. Thank you so much for joining me, and especially to my patrons and channel members. Today we are celebrating a bit of Christmas in July. After all, Christmas is supposed to be a celebration of the birth of Jesus, and nobody knows when that was, so it really doesn't matter when we celebrate. And I don't just mean that no one knows what day Jesus was supposed to have been born. No one knows the year or the place either. Go to Bethlehem, and the guides will show you a place that they think that it might have happened. You pay a lot of money to hear speculation on a possibility. I got into this project when I read an article on Hemet Meta's website that mentioned that the Gospel of Matthew has the Christmas story begin in Bethlehem and move to Nazareth, while Luke has it begin in Nazareth and moves it to Bethlehem. Being very familiar with both, this surprised me as I never looked at it this way. It also made me realize just how much I still think like a believer. I still think about the Gospels as being one cohesive story, even though they are not. While we dive into that topic, I will also be making creme brulee. I made a couple of mistakes in making this, but as you will see, they did not affect the final product. The first one is here. You're supposed to heat 1 quart of cream to a boil. I added the sugar. The sugar is supposed to go in with the eggs, not the cream. But you later mix the two together, so in the long run, it really doesn't matter. So here I have 1 quart of cream in a pan heating on high heat. I started on high to get it going, but I turn it down as it starts getting hot. Cream burns at the bottom if you heat it too quickly. If this happens, when you combine the cream and the eggs, just don't scrape the burnt part of the cream from the pan. It's pretty easy to avoid using the burnt cream. But it's better not to burn the cream if possible, then you don't waste the cream. Whipping cream and heavy cream are very similar. Whipping cream has 30 to 36% milk fat. Heavy cream is no less than 36% milk fat. Today I am using whipping cream. The original recipe that I adapted from calls for heavy cream. You really can use either one. Here, I am heating the cream to a boil. Stir constantly or nearly so to keep the cream from burning at the bottom. As soon as it is at a full boil, I will take it off the heat. Cover it to keep a film from forming on the top. I realized when I read about the movement issues between the Matthew and Luke accounts that I still think like a believer. I think of the Gospels as being one cohesive story. Thus, when I read the Matthew account, I keep in mind the events in the Luke account and incorporate them together in my mind as to the omitted details. But when you read them as separate stories, it becomes clear that they are not reporting the same events. In the Matthew account, Mary and Joseph are in Bethlehem. They don't need to travel there. There is no mention of a census, an inn, a stable, or angels. The birth itself seems completely uneventful. The Magi come to Herod afterward looking for Jesus, having seen a star in the east. And by the way, they were in the east and they traveled east and somehow managed to end up west. What is most interesting in chapter 2 is Joseph is warned by an angel to flee to Egypt, to escape the slaughter of the innocents ordered by Herod. An event not documented by any historian, by the way, but would be in keeping with Herod's character. Joseph and Mary remain in Egypt until after Herod dies. We have no idea how long this is, or what age Jesus is when the family leave Egypt. But an angel tells Joseph that Herod is dead. But from this next verse, it appears the angel was negligent in failing to mention that things aren't any better as Herod's son is now ruling. So Joseph decides to go to Nazareth in Galilee, as it is outside of the realm of Herod's son Archelaus. This does not sound like they are returning to their home. In fact, if Nazareth was in fact their home before Jesus was born, why did they go to Egypt at all? It would be more reasonable for them to return to their home, which was already outside of Herod's jurisdiction. The entire story seems contrived to make Jesus fulfill what the author believed were prophecies of what the Messiah is supposed to do. He seems to be laying out a case for Jesus being the Jewish Messiah. The cream has now had a bit of time to cool, and so now I separate 6 eggs, using the yolks and setting aside the whites to use someplace else. Incidentally, egg whites on avocado toast is delicious. Just fry the egg whites like you would a fried egg. Sugar? Here, I have just egg yolks and sugar, or at least that's what you're supposed to have here. I accidentally put the sugar in the cream, so I just have egg yolks here. As you see, I did not get a film on the cream as it cooled. If you do, you can pour the cream through a cheesecloth to strain out the film. Now we pour just a bit of the cream into the eggs, not too much, or you raise the temperature of the eggs too fast, and then the eggs will curdle. If you have bits of cooked egg in the mixture, if the egg looks like scrambled egg, your egg has curdled. The custard is ruined, and it will not work. Add a bit more cream and stir. Once you have about 1/3 of the cream into the egg mixture, you can start adding the cream in larger quantities. Once it is all in, now we pour the cream into our ramekins to bake. If you don't have ramekins, I have used short glasses. Just make sure that they are oven-proof. Put the ramekins into a larger dish that you will fill with water for a water bath. The water bath allows the custard to bake more evenly. As you see, I spilled quite a bit of the cream trying to pour it. A mixing bowl with a pour spout would have been better. I could also have scooped out the cream with a measuring cup or a ladle. To fix this, I take the ramekins out and pour the cream from the bottom of the pan into another ramekin. Now I'm ready to add the water. It doesn't matter if some of the cream gets into the water, you won't use it. But you do not want to get any of the water into your cream. That will ruin your custard. I use a cup to pour the water in to get it more precise. A tea kettle also works well. Now I put this in the oven. I have one ramekin that is not in the water bath, as it's too much trouble to make a separate water bath for just one that didn't fit. It also lets you see the difference of not using a water bath. We bake for 40 minutes, and while we wait, we return to our Christmas story. Most people are more familiar with the Luke version of the story, where Mary and Joseph travel to Bethlehem and find no room for them in the inn. In this version, they don't live there, but they go there because it is Joseph's ancestral home. And this story makes no sense. First, they are traveling to fulfill the requirements of a Roman census of Quirinius. Judea was ruled provincially by a king as an ally of Rome, not a Roman province, until the removal of Archelaus, Herod's son. In 6 CE, Rome annexed Judea and Syria, appointing Quirinius as governor. It was common practice to immediately take a census in a new territory for taxation purposes. According to Dr. Richard Carrier, it is historically impossible that a Roman census was conducted under a Roman provincial governor when Judea was still an allied kingdom. Thus, the census described in Luke could not possibly have been any census under Roman authority during the reign of Herod. Next is the ridiculous claim that Joseph would need to leave Galilee to travel to Judea to get counted for this census for tax purposes when he doesn't live in Judea. Why would he want to pay taxes as a resident of a region that he doesn't live in? Let's check on the dessert. The one that was not in the water bath is done. It's a bit overdone. The rest could use 5 more minutes.
Ah, crème brulee of shea.
Finally, if you merge the 2 stories, this is what the Holy Family would have to do to travel to all of the places that the 2 accounts claim that they traveled to. 1. Mary and Joseph start in Nazareth and travel to Bethlehem, a distance of 90 miles, so about 7 to 9 days of travel. After Jesus is born, they go to Jerusalem for the dedication, which must take place when the infant is 8 days old. Not too far, just 5.5 miles. They can do this in a day. But then they go back to Bethlehem. Why? If they came for the census, they should be going back to Nazareth now. According to Luke, they had no place to stay in Bethlehem. But for some weird reason, they return to Bethlehem so that the Magi can tell Herod that they are there, and then Herod can order the slaughter of the innocents. Because if they go back to Nazareth now, Jesus is going to miss out on 2 prophecies, and we can't have that, can we? But wait a minute. Luke 2:39 says after they fulfilled what the law required, they went back to Nazareth. So did they go back to Nazareth and then back to Bethlehem again? Most Bible scholars, in reconciling these stories, have them going back to Bethlehem so that the Matthew account can work. But they claim that Luke 2:39 doesn't say that they went back to Nazareth immediately after fulfilling the law, just that they went there eventually, by way of Bethlehem in Egypt. Next, they travel from Bethlehem to Egypt. We don't know where in Egypt, so I'm putting them in Cairo. It wasn't Cairo then, but this is being generous and not making them travel too far into the country. This would be a distance of about 260 miles, a journey that would take about a month, maybe longer traveling with an infant. And then Herod dies. They travel from there to Nazareth, about 300 miles, another month or so of travel. I think our creme brulee is done. Yep, the custard is set. We now need to let them cool for at least 2 hours or up to 14 days. I don't put them into the refrigerator while they are still hot. This is not good for your refrigerator. It makes it work too hard. So I let them cool here to room temperature and then move them to the refrigerator. How old is Jesus at this point? We have no idea. But Luke 2:41 tells us that every year Jesus' parents take him to Jerusalem. Now, I don't think they are traveling from Egypt to Jerusalem every year, so they had to have gone back to Nazareth to even make this possible. It really comes down to the fact that whoever wrote the Luke account never had Jesus going to Egypt. There is no indication of this, and the most plausible reading of the text is that they went to Nazareth after fulfilling their obligations at the temple, not back to Bethlehem and then to Egypt. Travel to Jerusalem annually, then, is also plausible. It also comes down to the 2 accounts being irreconcilable. Is it possible to make both accounts true? No, it isn't. The Roman census makes it impossible. If you overlook the census and admit that Luke got that part wrong, then it's possible to reconcile the 2 accounts, but it is not reasonable. Now the fun part on the creme brulee. I mixed the sugar with a bit of vanilla, about a teaspoon of vanilla for a half a cup of sugar. I used a bit too much sugar here. Use about 2 teaspoons on each ramekin. Then use a flame to melt the sugar. I use a kitchen blowtorch. You could use a cigarette lighter or a welding blowtorch too, but if you use the welding blowtorch, be careful. Turn the flame down low. Don't use a candle. The wax will drip on your custard. Flame it until the sugar melts. I like to go a bit longer and let the sugar just start to scorch a little. It makes for a harder crunch. But golden brown like this is considered the ideal. And voila, creme brulee. If the gospel accounts of Jesus' birth and early childhood were historical, he would be one of the most well-traveled babies of his day. The stories make sense as 2 different accounts of a fabled person, just like the fables about Merlin can't all be right, but as fables, sure. We got 2 fables about how Jesus was born. Are either of them true? Not likely. We know the story about the census is inaccurate. We know the slaughter of the innocents was highly unlikely to be a real event. So how do apologists reconcile the accounts? This attempt by John Oakes in Evidence for Christianity takes a stab at it by explaining that the Matthew account was indicating Joseph was living in his home and simply omits the part where they move from the stable. The author assumes the stable part from the other gospel, glossing over the fact that in the Matthew account there is no stable. He ignores entirely the issue of the census, the date problems, and the travel back and forth from Egypt to Jerusalem. Yes, it's easy to reconcile the accounts if you just focus on one small issue and ignore the elephant in the room. This attempt is similar. It tries to claim that each author simply omitted details not relevant to his audience. Dr. Peter Williams, the author of this article, claims the Holy Family could have gone from Jerusalem to Egypt and only stayed in Egypt a short time before traveling to Nazareth, overlooking the fact that Matthew never has the family in Jerusalem, meaning Joseph saw the angel while in Bethlehem, and the journey begins from Bethlehem. While it's possible that Matthew simply omitted this part, it does make the story suspect, as it's supposed to be inspired by the Holy Spirit, which is part of the omniscient God who would know that this omission would cause the story to be inaccurate by omission. A God that not only demands that you trust and obey him, but also only reveals himself in this book would be a deceptive God to inspire a story so inaccurate in detail as to omit a portion, and an implausible portion at that, and then expect the reader to simply believe that the two stories are one, when the way he inspired the writers to write them would, to any reasonable reader, appear not to be. If the Bible is in fact written for all people for all time, then the story should be sufficiently precise as to lend credence to the truth of the story, not get you to a point where you can conclude that it's possible, even though it is not reasonable. Thus, while it's possible to say that Joseph had the vision and left with the family from Jerusalem, is this reasonable? If the family in fact lived in Nazareth, which is outside of Herod's jurisdiction, the reasonable thing to do would be to go home to Nazareth, a much shorter journey. Making the ridiculous journey to Egypt when there was a much simpler solution to the problem, with no explanation for why they took the unreasonable route instead of the reasonable one, does not bode well for the truth of the story. In trials of civil negligence, we use a reasonably prudent person standard. What would a reasonable person do in the same or similar circumstances? A reasonable person would not take the route needed to reconcile the gospel accounts, leaving us with the God asking Joseph to do unreasonable things with no explanation as to why he asks this, and then asking the reader to believe in and trust in this unreasonable God. So while it's possible to make the stories both work, if you ignore the census issues, it isn't reasonable. I consider myself to be a reasonably prudent person. Thus, I cannot accept that these are two accounts of the same story. Rather, they are separate stories about the same legendary person. We just need to get more people to let go of the Jesus part of the holiday as being as much a legend as the Santa part. But hey, celebrating Christmas is fun. Have some creme brulee and live your life. And voila, creme brulee.